The crystal wine glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the walnut table, just as the ochre envelope was thrown down in front of me. A thin line of blood traced across my palm, but I barely felt it. The physical pain was nothing compared to the icy pressure building in my chest as more than 24 eyes turned toward me, none of them bothering to hide their curiosity, laced with a touch of satisfaction. My name is Ella, and this Thanksgiving dinner at my in-laws was unlike any other. "What's this?" I asked, my voice oddly calm despite the tremble in my hand as I reached for the envelope. "Divorce papers," Brandon's voice, my husband's, hit me like a gavel, calm, cold, as if he were announcing we were out of pumpkin pie. Before I could respond, Mildred, my mother-in-law, took a sip of wine and set her glass down with unmistakable superiority. "We thought it would be gentler to do this with the family present," she said, each word delivered like a royal decree. Gentler for whom? The question caught in my throat as I locked eyes with Julie, Brandon's sister, smirking behind her wine glass like she'd been waiting for this moment for years. "You filed for divorce? At Thanksgiving dinner?" I repeated, each word choking out slowly. "Sweetheart," Mildred continued, her icy eyes flicking over to me, "everyone here knows you were never really a fit for this family." Under the table, Lindsay, my best friend, who'd begged to come tonight, grabbed my hand and squeezed. She was the only reason I hadn't stood up and walked out the moment I arrived. I glanced down at the plate in front of me, slices of turkey, cranberry sauce, golden brown rolls, and suddenly felt sick. I had never felt so humiliated, and they weren't even trying to hide it. "Oh, come on," Julie chimed in, sarcasm dripping from her lips. "Everyone knows that little art studio behind the house is just your excuse not to get a real job." This time, the laughter came freely. Even a few cousins I'd assumed were neutral couldn't hold back their grins. I looked at Brandon, searching for something familiar. A flicker of regret, a trace of the man who once helped me paint every wall in my studio. But he avoided my gaze, as if I were a stranger in the house I once called home. "We just wanted to help you wake up," Mildred said, dabbing her lips with a pristine napkin. "This family needs someone sturdier." I took a deep breath. Beneath the tablecloth, my hand brushed against my purse. Inside it was a document I'd kept hidden for nearly a year, a deed to the house, signed over to me one night when Brandon was drunk on our 6th anniversary. He didn't remember a thing the next morning, but I did. "You're right," I said slowly, rising from my chair, blood dripping onto the expensive tablecloth. "I don't fit in with this family. I'm far above your standards." "What?" Brendan looked up, his face flushed. "Lindsay, can you take me to the hospital?" I asked, turning to my still stunned friend. "My hand's bleeding. Oh, and Mildred, you might want to wash that tablecloth soon. Blood stains if you leave it too long. Kind of like deed transfers?" The clattering of cutlery rang out. "What deed transfer?" Mildred asked, her voice suddenly off balance. I smiled, a small smile, but cold enough to drop the room's temperature. "Happy Thanksgiving. This may be the last meal you have in this house." And with that, I left the table behind, ignoring the shouting, the toppled chairs, and Brandon calling after me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. What I needed was to stop the bleeding and start the plan. Lindsay drove like the wind through quiet suburban streets lit with soft amber lights. I leaned to the side, hand wrapped in a blood-soaked napkin, still throbbing. But the sting was nothing compared to the rupture that had been waiting inside me for years, just waiting for tonight to break free. We pulled into a small emergency clinic. The doctor stitched the cut on my palm. 6 stitches. I didn't even flinch. In my mind, I was no longer the quiet little wife of the Harringtons. I was Ella, the only woman at that dinner table who stood up when everyone else expected her to stay down. Back at Lindsay's apartment in the city, I opened my phone and pulled up a draft I'd written months ago to my attorney, Gloria McDaniel, a sharp woman who'd won property disputes that seemed impossible to unravel. Subject: property at 118 Willow Creek. The time has come. I hit send. "Ella, are you sure about this?" Lindsay asked as I poured myself a glass of water. I looked at her, the only friend who never laughed at my dreams, the one who secretly brought buttered rolls to my studio when I painted through the night. "I've been silent too long," I said, voice low but firm. "Now it's their turn to listen." The next morning, Gloria arrived at Lindsay's as scheduled, carrying a thick folder and that lawyerly gaze. No emotion, no judgment, just strategy. "What do we do first?" I asked, setting my coffee on the table. "First, file the ownership confirmation at the local office," she said, flipping to a legally binding copy of the signed deed from Brandon. "Then serve the Harringtons with a 30-day eviction notice." I nodded, unblinking. The time had come. That evening I returned to the house I had lived in for 6 years, not as a daughter-in-law, but as the rightful owner. The grand estate stood quiet in the dark, the glass doors reflecting my headlights as I parked. I didn't knock. I rang the bell. Because I had every right to. Brandon answered, stunned at the sight of me. Long coat, hair neatly tied back, papers in hand. "Ella, about yesterday." "It's not about yesterday," I said, holding out the papers. "It's about the past 6 years. He stepped aside. The living room still smelled of wood and expensive perfume, but now it was just a facade. The people who once called me the outsider now sat on my couch, in my house, like they belonged. "What's this?" Mildred asked, eyeing the notice I placed on the glass table. "An order to vacate within 30 days, I replied, locking eyes with her. "This house has been legally mine since last year." "Brandon forgot?" Her face went pale. Julie exhaled. Brandon said nothing. For the first time, there were no snide remarks. "I don't plan to kick anyone out," I said slowly, "but if you thought you could push me out of my own life and just keep living here like nothing happened, you might want to read that notice carefully." I left in silence, behind me a suffocating house full of people now unsure of what had just happened. That night, I didn't sleep. I opened my laptop and revised the plan I'd once drafted as a girl with dreams pinned to every wall of the studio behind the house. I'd once dreamed of turning that space into an art gallery. Not for rejected pieces from prestigious exhibits, but for works dismissed by loved ones, cast aside by family. I had the vision, I had the name, The Haven, where art finds refuge. I smiled. It was time to show them I wasn't just some backyard painter. The next morning I stood before the large windows of the estate, once a symbol of Harrington power. Now it was an empty shell waiting to be reborn. The smell of old paint, plaster dust, and scratched walls mirrored a past I was finally ready to shed. Lindsay entered behind me holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She looked around and paused in the grand foyer. Once where Mildred made me polish the floors because it's the first impression for guests. "This place could be something else entirely," Lindsay said, eyes bright. "A real gallery, full of light, air, and freedom." I took the coffee and nodded. "Remember Professor Bennett, the one who taught restoration back in college? The one with the deep voice and stories about lost Renaissance paintings? That's him. He still has a studio just outside Boston. I've been working with him for over a year. Secretly, nights, weekends. While Brandon thought I was at yoga with friends." Lindsay laughed. "And now it's time to bring that secret into the spotlight?" I didn't answer, I just took out my phone and made the call. "Professor Bennett," I said when he picked up. "It's time." 3 days later, Professor Bennett's studio appeared like a slice of another world. Exposed brick walls, the scent of linseed oil, and sunlight slanting through towering windows. On the table was a portrait in mid-restoration. The woman's face looked like it had just awakened from a centuries-long sleep. "You're right on time," he smiled, removing his safety goggles. "I'm guessing the Harringtons finally learned what consequences look like?" "Not exactly," I said, placing the design draft on the table. "I don't want revenge through anger. I want to rebuild through art." "A bold idea," he said, furrowing his brow, but I saw the spark in his eyes. I pointed to the initial sketch. The grand hall would become the main gallery with natural light streaming through a skylight. Side rooms would be divided into a restoration studio, classrooms, and an exhibition space for emerging artists who hadn't yet had their shot. "What's it called?" he asked, washing his hands after flipping through the plans. "The Haven, a place where art is brought back to life." Professor Bennett nodded slowly, then led me to a side room filled with old paintings waiting to be restored. He pointed to a still life with a torn corner and smoke damage. "You want to create a space for things others deem beyond repair. I like that. Because I was once one of those things." He said nothing, just placed a hand gently on my shoulder. The following week when we returned to the estate, the architecture crew had already started removing the outdated wallpaper and hauling out the heavy armchairs Mildred once called French heritage. I stood among the dust, blueprint in hand, conducting each step like a symphony. On the 10th day, I sent out the first press release about the Haven. It was short, but clear. A mansion once symbolic of rigid tradition will soon become a sanctuary for rejected pieces of art. The response came faster than I expected. An independent art magazine reached out for an interview. A collector in Chicago offered to fund a section of the exhibit. And then came the final email that left me speechless. An invitation to collaborate with the Smithsonian Conservation Center. The same place that had rejected my internship application 3 years in a row, now wanted to learn from the open-access conservation model I was using at the Haven. One late afternoon, as amber light spilled into the now empty great room, I unrolled a new floor plan across the tiled floor, my eyes landing on the spot where the Harringtons' dining table used to be, where I'd once been handed divorce papers. That space would now be the centerpiece of the grand opening exhibit. The memory lingered, but it no longer weighed me down. Lindsay walked in, holding a box of fresh mail. "You got a handwritten letter," she said, handing me an envelope. I opened it. Inside was a single line that made me sit down. Overwhelmed. "Ella, if these walls could speak, I hope they'll tell the story of someone who turned brokenness into light. Professor Bennett." I smiled, softly, steadily. I was standing in the main gallery, what used to be the Harringtons' living room, when the gate buzzer rang, breaking my train of thought. Marcus, the new security guard from a professional firm, radioed in. "Miss Ella, there's a man named Brandon Harrington at the gate, says it's urgent." I glanced at the clock. 9 a.m. The kind of hour Brandon would pick. Too early for a casual visit. Too late for a sincere apology. "Let him in," I said calmly, "but only to the outdoor guest area. He's not to enter the house." 5 minutes later I stepped onto the porch. Brandon was there, hands in the pockets of his overcoat, face drawn, eyes bloodshot. Either from sleepless nights, or from realizing he'd lost something that couldn't be undone. "Thanks for seeing me," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. "You have 5 minutes," I replied, arms crossed. He swallowed hard. "Julie, she's pregnant." I raised an eyebrow. "And that concerns me how?" "We were planning to move back in this spring," he said, trying to stay composed. "This house? It's been in our family for 4 generations. Julie's child should be born here. To carry on the tradition." I let out a short laugh, not mocking but certainly not empathetic. "You want the child to grow up in a house where his mother laughed in my face when I presented my first artwork at dinner?" Brandon stayed silent. "You want him playing in the garden where your mother made me pull weeds all summer just so I'd look like a proper homemaker?" "Ella," he stepped forward, but I didn't move. "No, Brandon, I don't need another explanation." I pulled a fully approved floor plan of the Haven from my coat pocket, stamped and signed by the city. "This house is being renovated into a community arts center. It's funded, legally supported, and scheduled to open next month. All documents are in order." He took the papers, flipping through a few pages before looking up at me. "My mother will never agree to this." "Your mother," I said, voice firm, "no longer has a say here." That afternoon I was checking the gallery's lighting system when my phone buzzed. Unknown number, but I didn't need caller ID. "Oh." Mildred's voice cut through, sharp as ever. No pleasantries. "I'm requesting a meeting, immediately. I'm no longer under any legal obligation to meet you, Mrs. Harrington." "You don't understand the consequences," she said, and for the first time I detected urgency beneath her commanding tone. "This family has influence. You won't be left in peace if you dismantle tradition like this." I smiled slightly but without softness. "I'm not dismantling tradition. I'm building a new one. More human, more open, and not rooted in disdain." Then I hung up. The next day Mildred actually showed up, but this time she couldn't get in. From the security camera I saw her in a black cashmere coat, standing at the gate, gesturing at Marcus. Marcus stayed firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrington, Miss Ella doesn't take unscheduled visitors. If you need to submit documents, we have a secure drop box at the gate." She stared directly into the camera, as if trying to burn a hole through the screen. And I stood there, right in front of the monitor, watching her. The woman who once controlled every inch of this house, now halted by a gate for which only I had the key. That evening I received an email from the Harringtons' lawyer, an offer to buy back the house at twice its market value. I replied with one sentence. I'm not interested in money, I'm interested in purpose. I leaned back in my chair, gazing at the large wall where the centerpiece for the grand opening would soon hang. Soft amber light illuminated the unfinished sketch shards of glass arranged into butterfly wings. A symbol of something once shattered, now taking flight. They could be angry, they could resist, they could offer as much money as they wanted. But the one thing they could never reclaim was the voice. And for the first time in my life, I knew I had taken it back. On opening night, the haven radiated warmth against the gray chill of winter. Golden lights spilled across the exposed brick walls, highlighting each piece of art lining the main hallway, once the stately foyer of the Harrington estate. The very people who once called this place a family legacy could never have imagined that one day it would echo with applause from artists across the city. I stood behind a small backstage curtain set up inside the gallery space, fingers lightly gripping a glass of water, my index finger twisting the edge of a napkin. With every passing minute, more guests arrived. Reporters, collectors, curators from major museums, and even a few familiar faces who had once rejected my submission packets 3 years ago. Lindsay approached in a deep emerald velvet dress she'd had tailored just for this night. You have to see it out there. There's a line around the block, and Channel 6 just set up a camera by the stairs. I nodded, saying nothing. My heart pounded. Not from fear, but from knowing this time, I had nothing left to lose. Outside, the docent began the guided tour of the first piece. I heard footsteps on the hardwood floors, camera shutters clicking, and soft murmurs. This is incredible. Who would have thought this was once a private mansion? At exactly 8 o'clock, a soft chime rang, signaling the start of the speeches. I stepped out, the spotlight catching the wooden podium where I now stood, facing a full gallery. Thank you all for coming tonight, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. This place was once filled with silence, forced expectations, and whispered judgment. But tonight, it is handed over to stories that are real, uncensored, and unapologetic. I turned toward the large painting in the center, still covered by a black cloth. This piece was created over the course of a year, through sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and times when I thought I wasn't strong enough to continue. I gave the signal, 2 staff members gently pulled the cloth away. Behind it stood a massive painting, oil, fragments of old newspapers, and shards of broken glass assembled into glimmers of light. At the center, a flipped dining table, shattered crystal glasses, and mirrored pieces reflecting dozens of faces. Pain, anger, helplessness. And finally, in the center, a woman standing tall, holding a paintbrush, her gaze steady and forward-facing. Reclamation, I said, not just art, it's dignity, it's voice, it's me. The room went silent. Then, applause. At first scattered, then rising, wave after wave. A critic from the Boston Review approached, requesting an exclusive interview. A collector from New York leaned toward Lindsay and whispered, I want to buy the original, name the price. In the midst of the crowd, the front door unexpectedly opened. All eyes turned. Mildred Harrington entered, back straight, eyes unyielding. Behind her were Brandon and Julie, her pregnancy now unmistakable. I thought this was a public space, Mildred said, her voice cold. Of course, I replied, stepping forward with a smile. Everyone's welcome, even those who once called art a cheap pastime. The room stirred. Reporters turned their cameras. You've used the Harrington name to stage a personal scandal, she snapped. You've disgraced my family's legacy. I didn't disgrace your tradition, I said calmly. I simply told the truth of what I lived. Through art. I gestured to the central piece. This is truth. This is my voice. And for the first time, it's being heard. Mildred opened her mouth to respond, but another round of applause cut her off. From the corner, a silver-haired man stepped forward, the lead curator from the New England Museum of Fine Arts. Mrs. Harrington, he said, your son should be proud. We're considering this piece for next year's exhibit, Women and the Voice After Silence. Mildred clutched her purse, silent. Julie lowered her head. Brandon quietly stepped back. I said nothing more. I simply turned to Lindsay and raised my glass. "What are we toasting to?" she asked. "To the words that once broke me," I said. "Now the foundation of something new." And when I looked back, the spotlight once again hit the painting, its broken glass catching the light like fractured rainbows across the ceiling. This wasn't revenge. This was rebirth. Monday morning, I was in my second-floor office at the Haven, flipping through exhibit contracts from a gallery in Seattle when my phone buzzed. It was Lindsay, her voice barely a whisper in shock. "Ella, turn on the TV, Channel 9, it's about the Harringtons." I reached for the remote, hands trembling slightly. The bright red headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Harrington Capital under investigation. For financial misconduct, millions missing." The anchor spoke gravely. "Sources say Mildred Harrington, head of the firm, and her son Brandon are under suspicion for using client funds for personal investments, including leveraging properties, one of which is the family estate on Willow Creek." I froze. My heartbeat pounded, not out of joy, but a cold realization. If I hadn't filed the ownership transfer in time, everything I built could have vanished like a house of cards. The phone rang again. This time it was Gloria. "My lawyer." "Ella, I checked. Good thing you filed early, otherwise that property would have been listed in the FBI's asset seizure file." I exhaled, looking out the window to the front garden, where a few students were setting up for the afternoon's restoration class. "What about Brandon?" "Cooperating with investigators, and seems he's blaming everything on his mother." I nodded slowly, not surprised. That night I was applying a sealant coat to a 19th century frame when my phone rang. "The caller ID?" I hesitated, then picked up. "Ella," her voice was hoarse, nearly unrecognizable. I have nowhere else to go." I said nothing. Julie paused, then continued, choking up. "Brandon's cut me off, my mother's been subpoenaed, and I'm about to give birth. Now I have no home, no money, no one." I was silent. The memories returned, her mocking smile during my first exhibit, her laughter when Mildred called me too plain for art. "I'm not asking for much, but if there's any guest room, I'll pay later, just somewhere to sleep until the baby comes." Her voice cracked. "Please, not for me, for the child." I looked at my hands, still smudged with paint, the same hands that once trembled as I was handed divorce papers over Thanksgiving dinner, but now they were building something that mattered. I took a deep breath. "The guest house behind the garden is empty. I'll reset the code. You can stay until you find another way." Julie was silent, then came a quiet sob on the other end of the line. 3 hours later, an old silver car pulled up to the Haven. I opened the gate. Julie stepped out, visibly thinner, her belly rounded. In her hand a faded canvas bag. No more luxury coats, no more heels or designer perfume. Standing before me was a woman stripped down to her rawest self, a version of Julie Harrington no one had ever seen. "Thank you," she said, eyes red. "I know I don't deserve it." I led her down the stone path, past the newly planted garden. The guest house was clean, with running water, fresh linens, and lights already on. Before I left, I paused on the front step. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the child who never got to choose any of this, and because I believe no one should be forever defined by their past mistakes." Julie nodded softly, tears falling. I turned away without another word. Back in the studio, I looked up at the reclamation painting in the center of the hall. The broken glass still reflected light, as if alive. A new message echoed in me. Sometimes forgiveness isn't for others to sleep well. It's for you to finally be free. I sat down at my drafting table and began sketching for the spring exhibition. The theme this time? Rebuilding from ashes. And I knew, somewhere in the corner of that back garden, a woman was beginning her own chapter. The gate buzzer rang on a spring morning. Sunlight filtered through the tree canopy, stretching across the weathered brick walls of the Haven, now a well-regarded art restoration and exhibition center. I glanced at the security camera. The figure at the gate wore a light gray sweater and cradled a carefully wrapped painting. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, but that face, unmistakable. Mildred Harrington. I let the screen go dark and took a deep breath before speaking into the intercom to Marcus. Let her in, but only her. She walked into the reception room with slow, measured steps. Gone was the proud tilt of her chin from years past. She set the painting on the table and gently unwrapped it, revealing an old portrait of a young woman with softly curled hair and a distant gaze. The colors had faded, and fine cracks stretched like spiderwebs across the surface. "This is my mother," she said quietly. "It's been in the attic for nearly 30 years. I forgot it was even there." I nodded, remaining silent. She continued slowly. "Ella, I know I wronged you. I dismissed your dreams, I helped push you out of this family, and when everything fell apart, I realized the only thing left standing was what was honest." I sat down across from her. "I can restore this painting," I said, my eyes tracing a crack along the frame, "but it will never be exactly the same, and that's a good thing." Mildred looked up, puzzled. "Because those cracks," I continued, "are what make it precious. The past doesn't need to be erased, it needs to be acknowledged, then rebuilt, with understanding and grace." She sat in silence for a long while, then finally said, "I'm not here to ask, I'm here to learn. If you'll allow it, I'd like to work here. Administrative tasks, cleaning, taking notes, anything. I need to make something right. Not to undo the past, but to live better." I leaned back, considering, then pulled a file from the drawer. "Start Monday, someone will train you on digital records. And this painting," I pointed to it, "is scheduled for restoration next week, but I want you involved." She nodded, and in the eyes that once held nothing but frost, I saw, for the first time, something deeply human. Gratitude. In the days that followed, Mildred showed up consistently. No luxury car, no designer handbags, just her, in a simple studio uniform, quietly entering data, dusting frames, and sometimes sitting for long moments in front of student works in progress. Julie had settled into the guest house. She enrolled in a short course on antique painting restoration, saying she wanted to understand the things I once dismissed. The baby arrived on a late weekend afternoon. A healthy boy, with deep blue eyes like Brandon's but with a far gentler gaze. Julie named him Isaac. Unexpected joy. That evening I stood with Francisco in the main restoration studio. Sunset poured through the tall windows, casting soft light over Mildred's mother's portrait as we worked on the background. "You've changed this place," Francisco said, still gently brushing away old varnish. "And the people within it." I smiled, looking around at the young apprentices. Some came from top art schools, others had dropped out years ago, but all of them were focused, delicate, treating each crack as a memory to be honored. "None of us are perfect," I said, adjusting the magnifying lens. "But in learning how to restore, we also learn how to look at life, not to erase it, but to understand and reimagine it." Francisco nodded. "And sometimes," he added, "what was once broken becomes more beautiful than the original." That evening I stepped into the garden. A light breeze carried the scent of newly bloomed lavender. Julie was pushing a stroller, Mildred jotting notes by the porch. Isaac slept soundly, lips curled into a soft smile, as if dreaming of a world untouched by pain. I looked up at the house, once a symbol of pressure and judgment, now reborn. Not a victory. A healing. A work of art being redrawn, not by erasing the past, but by making it more honest, more meaningful, through its imperfect lines. And I knew from that moment on, I wasn't just an artist. I was a keeper of memories, and I was giving them their chance to live again in the gentlest way possible. Ella's story is proof that the cracks in our lives don't make us weak, they're the foundation for something stronger. She turned pain into purpose, transforming a house once defined by scorn into a thriving center of creativity. In real life, we've all been dismissed or broken at some point, but when we choose to rise, heal, and build meaning from that pain, life rewards us with freedom and the deepest form of growth. What do you think about Ella's journey? Was her forgiveness a weakness or her true strength? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful stories about family and resilience.